So good evening, welcome. We are very happy to see you here again. Uh, I'm very happy to open the second day of the Poetry International Festival, number 3. I'm Gilad Meiri, and I'm the artist director of the Poetry Place and Festival with the poetess Noah Shakarji. And I'm honored to introduce Tal Nitzan. Tal is a poet, is a writer, editor, translator. She has published books of poetry, 7 books of poetry, 6 children's books, 2 novels, and a collection of stories. 13 selected translations of her poetry have been published around the world, and she herself has translated approximately 80 works of Spanish and English in Hebrew. Tal has won many literary awards. She's one of the founders and editors of the free online magazine, Garage. Tal will host this event, and she will shortly present Howard Altmann. But first, some technical issues. Your microphone will be muted during the event, but we will dedicate the last 2 minutes or so to your questions. So you may write them in the chat box during the event. And now I'm very happy to pass the microphone to you, Tal, and I wish you a beautiful evening.
Thank you, Gilad. Hi, Howard. It's wonderful to have you here. And good evening to all our Hebrew and English-speaking friends. I'll make a short intro in Hebrew, which I know Howard can understand, and then we'll move on to a bilingual reading and talk in English. Howard Altmann הוא משורר יליד מונטריאול, קנדה, שחי בניו יורק. פרסם 3 ספרי שירה, 2 בארצות הברית, והשלישי דו-לשוני באנגלית ובתרגום לפורטוגזית. מלבד שירה הוא כתב גם מחזות וספרי ילדים, והנחה סדנה לשירה בבית כלא לנשים. נבחר משיריו, לסלוח לזמן, יצא כאן בשנה האחרונה בתרגומי, בהוצאת קשב לשירה, ויש לי כבר בשורה אחת משמחת, בדיוק בעוד חודשיים מהיום, ב-23 במאי, מתוכנן מפגש עם האווארד בחיים עצמם, בחנות סיפור פשוט בתל אביב, וכולכם מוזמנות ומוזמנים. So we'll move on to the reading. Howard, welcome again.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
It's wonderful to have you. And we'll start with the first poem titled Passage. Microphone is yours.
Okay, so it'll be English Hebrew, not Hebrew English.
That's the order it was written.
Okay, fair enough. That's good. Thank you, Tal. Thank you for your kind words, and nice to have everyone here. So we'll be reading a few poems. I think all of them are rather short. Passage. The man reading by the light is light to another man walking in the dark, who is darkness to another man turning off a light. This is the wind. The boy reaching for a ball is play to another boy standing in a window, who is a window to another boy turning from the game. This is the wind. The tree bending its arms is straight talk to another tree, yet to announce itself, which is silence to another tree hollowed from within. This is the moon in the wind.
מעבר. האיש הקורא לאור המנורה הוא אור לאיש אחר הולך בחושך, שהוא חושך לאיש אחר המכבה את האור. זוהי הרוח. הילד המושיט יד אל כדור ומשחק לילד אחר עומד ליד החלון, שהוא חלון לילד אחר פורש מן המשחק. זוהי הרוח. העץ המחופף ענפיו הוא דיבור ישיר לעץ אחר שטרם מתבשר, שהוא שתיקה לעץ אחר חלול בתוכו. זהו הירח ברוח. שנייה אחת.
I like the poem better in Hebrew.
Well, since you mentioned the sound of this poem, there's in many of your poems, there's very distinct music and rhythm, as we can hear in Passage, many others. Is this something that just happens in your writing, or is it something you aim for? What's your relationship with music in general and music in poetry?
It's a good question. I think it's not intentional. I think it's unconscious. I'm always flattered when it's mentioned that there's musicality in any of the poems I've written. You know, I grew up accompanying my father to synagogue every Shabbat, and whether or not that was the first imprint of musicality and the repetition that sometimes appears in my poems, it's certainly possible, but it is not intentional. It is really just, it sort of emerges from the poem.
What music do you like?
What music do I like?
Yeah, maybe I should tell everyone that we met in New York and we went to, I think, the only jazz concert that was going on. It was during the first stage of the epidemic, more or less.
Right.
And we found, you found one place in the village that played jazz that evening.
Yeah. You know, I in truth, I like all music. From classical to rock to jazz. There isn't. I'd say what plays on my stereo most often is classical and piano. But I don't. If I'm a frustrated musician, it's possible. But I'm always surprised when people say that there's musicality in the poems, because it's not. It's not intentional. I'm happy to hear it. Yeah.
Well, it's true. It's definitely true. Let's hear the music of the second poem.
Fragments. An old man with a new hat is running out of pride. I want to tell the truth, but I don't know how. The wind is our best pen, and it blows poetry out of the water. I wait for days and weeks to enter a feeling that's had years to leave. The ocean keeps throwing questions it has all the answers to. A candle lights a room and dims the stars. When all that consoles no longer, loneliness finds a room inside the one it knows. I am shrinking from the light and turning into space. An old man with a new hat wears his smile in the dark.
רסיסים. גבר זקן בכובע חדש, וגאוותו אוזלת והולכת. אני רוצה לומר את האמת, אבל איני יודע כיצד. הרוח היא הטובה בעתנו, והיא נושבת שירה מתוך המים. אני מחכה ימים ושבועות כדי לחדור אל רגש שלקח שנים להותירו מאחור. האוקיינוס מוסיף להשליך שאלות שכל התשובות עליהן ידועות לו. נר מאיר חדר ומעמעם את הכוכבים. כשכל מה שניחם חדל לנחם, הבדידות מוצאת לה מקום בתוך האחד המוכר לה. אני מתכווץ מפני האור ופונה לחלל. גבר זקן בכובע חדש, פותח חיוך בחושך. כל כך יפה. This is one of my favorite poems. It's so exposed and transparent, with supposedly a minimal rhetoric, yet mysterious and suggestive. It's quite surprising that you are a late bloomer poet. You started writing poetry relatively late in life, taking a sharp turn after a career in finance. You told me that you then became obsessive about poetry. Can you tell us how this came to be?
I did take a sharp turn, and it's not really clear. It's a surprise to me as well, I think, as it was a surprise to most of the people who've known me. I left the financial world and started writing plays, and there was some early traction in playwriting, and then not much really happened with the plays, and I started writing poems just for myself. And with a play, a lot of things have to happen in order for it to get produced. You need actors, the director, you need a theater to endorse it and support it. With a poem, it's just you and a piece of paper. So I think there was some appeal to that relative to playwriting. And then I slowly became more obsessed with the form. And I think poetry allows me to be, I guess, freer on an emotional and an intellectual level. And the poems, I think, as I've written more poems, they've gotten more abstract, and poetry, for me at least, that the genre appeals to me just on that level alone. So it's been an organic evolution. Yeah, and I should add, and I'm not saying this because this is I'm speaking to Israel, but I came to poetry through the poetry of Yehuda Amichai, reading his translations in English. I was never a huge fan of poetry as a youth, but in reading the poems of Yehuda Amichai, that's how I entered, and I said, oh, one can write poems like this, and that was sort of the beginning. So having a book of poems in Hebrew, it's full circle on some level, and deeply meaningful and satisfying to me.
Oh, that's fascinating. And who are your favorite poets in general, aside from Amichai?
I guess, there are many. I tend to return to a few. I tend to return to Wallace Stevens. I tend to return to John Ashbery. I don't necessarily understand their poems all the time, but they transport me to another realm. And in being transported to the other realm, I am somehow comforted in the reading of their work. So those are two that are sort of on my nightstand almost religiously.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Shall we read Budapest?
Sure. Budapest, 1944. In the unswayable darkness, a tree shivers at night. By the sweeping light of noon, an old grip holds. At the shaking of the spirit, a half moon touches ground. Hand over hand, body over body, wisdom never makes it home. Page after page, book after book, bruised apples make the sauce. Mouth to water, glass to table, truths get put down. The ocean knows the sun goes only so deep. The melting of the snow freezes memory to that place. And a generation passing down colors the icicles of spring.
Yeah, we can definitely hear that music we mentioned. בודפשט 1944. בחושך העיקש עץ נרעד בלילה. לאור הצהריים הניגר נמשכת אחיזה נושנה. כשהנשמה נסערת, חצי הריח נוגע באדמה. יד על יד, גוף על גוף. התבונה לא מגיעה הביתה לעולם. דף אחר דף, ספר אחר ספר, מתפוחים פגומים נעשה הרוטב. פה אל מים, כוס אל השולחן, מונחים דברי אמת. האוקיינוס יודע שהשמש צוללת רק עד כאן. הפשרת השלגים מקפיאה את הזיכרון לשם, ודור מוריש צבעים לדור, וצובע את נטפי הקרח של האביב. Your Jewish identity and the history of your family are present in your poetry. You write, wisdom never makes it home. Is the translation and publication of your work in Hebrew in a way making it home for you?
Absolutely. Hebrew is as a holy language. I believe, and listening to you read the poems in Hebrew, I have to be honest. There is the poems touch me in a different way listening to you read them in Hebrew than certainly listening to myself read them in English. Yes, having the poems translated into Hebrew is a very meaningful thing, even though my own straying from my certainly religious observance, but I don't, that doesn't diminish the impact of having the poems translated into Hebrew for me. And in this particular poem, wisdom never makes it home. For those who are listening, who are not aware, my father was a survivor of the Holocaust and is from Hungary. And the spring of 1944 is when the Nazis came. So, of course, as everyone here, I'm sure knows, they never expected that the Nazis would make it to Hungary so late in World War II. So that is a reference. Wisdom never makes it home is a reference to that time.
Mm. Wow. And where is your quite good Hebrew from? I mean, you're a very good Hebrew reader and listener, relatively.
You're very generous, Tal. I studied, I grew up in Montreal and we went to Hebrew day school. So that Hebrew, French, and English were the three languages from kindergarten through the end of high school. And I also was a madrich one summer for a high school trip to Israel.
Didn't know that.
Yeah, so that's it. But my Hebrew needs some good polishing. So, like
every sleeping language, but they're there. They're sleeping in the darkness and waiting to wake up or to be woken.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Maybe we'll touch another language here in the next poem. Island.
Island. The moment one says it is a moment of perfection, it is something less than perfection. So on the island of Fernando de Noronha, I will be quiet now. I will let the birds speak Portuguese. I will let the waters speak dialects of green. I will let the rocks tell me I was never really born, and the vistas carry my insights to an early death. I will let the breeze nudge my years off one cliff here and one cliff there. I will let the air confiscate my passport, and I will let the sand send my battles to the sea. Let them all simply make an island out of me. The moment I say I am lost without love, I will be something less than lost.
ברגע שאתה אומר זה רגע מושלם, הרגע נעשה פחות ממושלם. לכן על האי פרננדו דה נורוניה אשתוק עכשיו. אתן לציפורים לדבר בפורטוגזית. אתן למים לדבר בניבים של ירוק. אתן לסלעים לומר לי שמעולם לא נולדתי באמת, והנופים יסחפו את הרהוריי אל מוות בטרם עת. אתן לרוח הקלה להדוף את שנותיי מצוק אחד כאן וצוק אחר שם. אתן לאוויר להחרים את דרכוני, ואתן לחול לשלח את מלחמותיי לים. ייצרו כל אלה בפשטות, היא מחוץ לעצמי. ברגע שאומר שאני אבוד ללא אהבה, אהיה פחות מאבוד. This poem brings to mind two questions. First one is, you visited Portugal several times and you told me this is where some of your first poems were written. Do you find it necessary sometimes to get away from one's language and from all the well-known and familiar in order to find one's voice and to re-encounter oneself? And that's one thing. And the other thing that comes to mind when I read this poem is in several of your poems, there is kind of a very complex relationship between reality, so to say, between life, between the self, and between language and words. And what happens in that transition between thing or experience or something lived and it's let's say it's being put into words and what it becomes then. So if you would like to elaborate on one of these or both directions.
Yeah, I'll address the first one. You know, your question also has an answer built into it, in the sense that yes, I've spent a lot of time. This particular poem comes from Brazil. Fernanda de Noronha is from Brazil, but I have spent a lot of time in Lisbon, at least a dozen trips to Lisbon, and Lisbon is probably where I wrote my first poem. So there was something about being in a foreign country where the light is spectacular and interesting, and it's built on 7 hills. But there was, as much as it was comforting to be in Lisbon, there was a sense of unknown, and I think that was freeing for me. So whenever I've traveled, I've always found it freeing, and I found that especially so in Lisbon. And anyone who's been to Lisbon can sort of feel history vibrate through the streets, and I'm sure that's an element to why that particular place has always and continues to sort of touch me. Many poems that were written in New York got started in Lisbon. This particular poem was from a trip to Brazil. I'm not sure I can answer the second half of your question about language and words, and I think you've stumped me. Forgive me.
No, well, it will remain a mystery why the moment one says it is a moment of perfection, it is something less than perfection. And the moment I say I'm lost without love, I'll be something less than lost.
Okay, well, you know, I think things get lost in when they are spoken, and it's a private belief, I suppose. And I think things are retained and hold their matter. And it could be psychologically that anytime I have spoken and expressed, there was some diminishment in the process of the expression. So if one, you know, if I were to do some self-analysis, I'm not saying it's good self-analysis, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's an element there that I've always felt that feelings are best, feelings should be expressed, but there's a risk in the expression, in that words, language can never fully capture what a feeling is. Of course, I'm a poet, and that's what I try and do. But
yeah, that's what I was about to say. There's something painful about it. To hearing it well, of course, I totally sympathize. I think this is our struggle as you know, as people who work with words, who express themselves not, let's say, with paint and music, but with words, and try to make it something that is not less, but sometimes maybe even more. And you know, there's always this risk that you mentioned, and it's extremely interesting to hear it from someone who, you know, gave up another way of life, another career, in order, in a way, to commit to words, to commit to this fragile way of expression. It's a constant struggle, I guess.
I agree, and you articulate it well. It is a fragile expression, and a very fragile enterprise. So
yeah, I think it's almost tangible in your poems, the feeling of walking on the verge of falling, of breaking, of losing, and yet holding on to it. I think we do have time to read Stones, so let's go on to Stones. Would you like to read it, Howard?
Sure. Stones. I would like to be a stone by the side of a road, on a roadless island, of no interest to man, of no curiosity to animals, invisible to birds. I would like to step out of my stone and be another stone, on the other side of the road, prized by man, of solace to animals, a spot for birds. And on my stone, both stones, please.
אבנים. לו הייתי אבן לצד הדרך, על אי נטול דרך, נטול עניין לבני האדם, שאינו מסקרן את בעלי החיים, סמוי מעין הציפורים. לו יצאתי מן האבן שלי והייתי לאבן אחרת, בצידה האחר של הדרך, שבני האדם מוכירים, שמעניק נחמה לבעלי החיים, מדרך רגל לציפורים. ולו ינוחו על האבן שלי שתי האבנים. Why don't we go on to the next two poems, Words and Bleach Hills?
Wonderful. Words. We miss what we miss. In adulthood, we miss childhood. In January, we miss July. In the city, we miss the country. In the desert, we ask for clouds. We miss what we miss. With one view, we miss another. With one memory, another speaks. With one desire, another whispers. With one night, others are lit. We miss what we miss. When it passes, it stays. When it feeds, its hunger grows. When it fills, it empties. When it matures, it loses age. We miss what we miss. To what we miss, years. To how we miss, seconds. To where we miss, timelessness. To why we miss, the end of time. We miss what we miss. And in all the missing, a life. And in the life, a mourning. And in the mourning, a story. And in the story, words.
מילים. חסר לנו מה שחסר. בבגרות חסרה הילדות. בינואר חסר לנו יולי. בעיר חסרים השדות. במדבר נבקש עננים. חסר לנו מה שחסר. עם הנוף האחד חסר האחר. עם זיכרון אחד מדבר אחר. עם תשוקה אחת אחרת לוחשת. עם לילה אחד אחרים מוארים. חסר לנו מה שחסר. כשזה עובר זה יישאר. כשזה אוכל זה רעב יותר. כשזה מתמלא זה מתרוקן. כשזה מבשיל זה לא מזדקן. חסר לנו מה שחסר. למה שחסר לנו שנים. לאופן שחסר לנו שניות. להיכן שחסר לנו נצח. לסיבה שחסר לנו קץ הזמנים. חסר לנו מה שחסר. ובכל החסר חיים. ובחיים האבל. ובאבל סיפור. ובסיפור מילים.
Tal, may I ask, there's an echo. Is that from me? Okay. I was wondering if I can ask you a question.
Okay. Go on.
You've done so much translation in your life, and I consider my poems, in many ways, my language is it's rather simple. It's not. I'm not using very complex adjectives in my language. What did you? What did you? So I don't. There's always a challenge when you're translating, and it's a longer discussion about translation. But I guess what I am curious about was, what did you find most challenging in the translation of my poems?
I'll mention two things. One of them we did talk about, and that's a good point to ask about it, because I mean musicality, and we could hear it in this poem, which is so rhythmical and so musical, and this is something you definitely don't want to lose in the transition to another language. Luckily, I happen to be a translator to Hebrew, which is a very musical language in itself, and it's very good for poetry and for music. And sometimes you just have to, let's say, commit to Hebrew. You have to give yourself to Hebrew, and it will carry you with the music. And the other thing, you say that your English is relatively simple, and that's true about, maybe your choice of words and the adjective, as you say, but איך אומרים תחביר, גלעד? שים מיקרופון. מי נותן לי תחביר באנגלית?
Grammar.
לא grammar. תחביר של משפט. Yeah, but let's try. Your syntax. Thank you.
Tal,
Thank you, Noah.
syntax.
Great.
Syntax.
Let me tell you, Howard, your syntax and your grammar in general is not simple at all. Not at all. It's very personal. Sometimes idiosyncratic even. And that's very challenging to recreate in Hebrew. Because the process of translating is like breaking something down, and then you have to build it anew. And it's always a risk. You never know if you won't end up with just a pile, of broken parts or fragments, as the first or second poem we read. And you have to build it again in a very different and distant syntax, which is the Hebrew one, and still preserve, the breathing and the life and the force of the original poem. So I'd say this was one of the greatest challenge. And maybe I'll mention a third thing is that your poems, as I found out, are always evolving, are always being written And when I would ask you a question, we've been exchanging emails while I was translating. And many times when I would ask you one question, it would just bring like an avalanche of new questions. Because your approach to your poems was always very dynamic. And many times there wasn't just, a simple yes or no answer that would, like put an end to a question, to a matter, but just would open new possibilities. And that's another challenge, like to keep all the plurality of possibilities, yet eventually you have to choose, you have to make your choice. And sometimes in Hebrew, it's even more cruel than in other languages, because I think in many aspects, Hebrew is very tough. Just to mention feminine and masculine. And sometimes I would, have to, if you remember, have to make you choose, like the gymnasist or the doctor or the you. Is it going to be female or male in Hebrew? We have, both possibilities in Hebrew, in English, but in Hebrew we have to make this cruel choice.
Wow, thank you.
Thank you for trusting. Now you know what a risk you took. Shall we read The Bleached Field?
The bleached field. The days rolled into hay, and the hay fed me as I'd become a horse whose stall was the wind, a metaphor that chased me till it ate my bones. View the bougainvillea now. It is yours to hold, magenta to inhale, to exhale, to cut from this poem, given to water, to soil, the bleached field. You see, the rain washes nothing away. Not the white from the white page, not the anger in the grass, not the man hungry for a coin or a stallion's eyes at night.
השדה צרוב השמש. הימים התגלגלו בחציר, והחציר הזין אותי. מאחר שהייתי לסוס שאורבתו היא הרוח, מטאפורה שרדפה אותי עד שאכלה את עצמותיי. ראה את הבוגנביליה, אחוז בה. עכשיו היא שלך, ארגמן לשאוף ולנשוף. לגזור מתוך השיר הזה מתת למים, לקרקע. השדה צרוב השמש. אתה רואה? הגשם אינו שוטף דבר. לא את הלובן מהדף הלבן, לא את הכעס בדשא, לא את האדם הרעב למטבע, או עיניים של שיח בלילה. In the former poem, Howard, you wrote, looking for it, in the city we miss the country. And that's another thing that's quite surprising. You lived most of your life in large cities like Montreal and New York, and yet your poetry is full of nature. One can almost envision a poet living in the country.
Yeah, it's a little bizarre. I grew up on a quiet street in a quiet suburb of Montreal, where there was, one tree on every lawn, and if the tree made it up to the electrical wires, that was a big thing. And if there was a caterpillar on the sidewalk, that was an event. And then I moved to New York City. So nature, I think, is a backdrop in many of my poems, nature being I guess the ultimate arbiter of truth, perhaps. you know, the gulls feeding on a riverbed. I mean, their agendas are written in the sky for everyone to see. So nature doesn't hide its truth, and I think that element more than any other is I think on a psychological level why I return to nature as frequently as I do, despite having lived and live in an urban, very urban environment.
Maybe sometimes missing something. Yeah, we miss what we miss. Maybe the missing, the thing missed. We miss it so much that it's.
I think that is an element as well. It's not. I don't mean to discount my appreciation for nature in any way, but I think that's a point well taken, Tal.
Yeah, yeah. We don't take nature. As city dwellers, we don't take nature for granted.
Correct, and I think New York City, especially, and how I've encountered New York City, as much as I have enjoyed living in the city, part of the enjoyment is in the you are resisting the elements of the city. You are fighting the city, but in that struggle, in that fight, you know, flowers hopefully sort of emerge, and when you are ensconced in nature, you can simply get lost in it and not find it in a way that you can in an urban environment, certainly from a poetic standpoint. At least that has been my experience. So.
Yeah, it's like the famous joke by David Foster Wallace about the two fish in water.
I don't know.
How does it go? Two young fish swim in the water, and an older fish goes by and says to them, how pleasant is the water today, right, guys? And he goes by, and then one of the younger fish says to its friend, what's water?
It's wonderful.
Yeah, so
I wish I could pull up a joke like that whenever I'm having a discussion about poetry.
I always tell the same joke. It's good for most things. Our last poem is a very good poem to end the reading with, and then hopefully we'll have some questions and answers. The Chess Player.
The Chess Player. They've left. They've all left. The pigeon feeders have left. The old men on the benches have left. The white gloved ladies with the Great Danes have left. The lovers who thought about coming have left. The man in the three-piece suit has left. The man who was a three-piece band has left. The man on the milk crate with the Bible has left. Even the birds have left. Now the trees are thinking about leaving too, and the grass is trying to turn itself in. Of course, the buses no longer pass, and the children no longer ask. The air wants to go and is in discussions. The clouds are trying to steer clear. The sky is reaching for its hands. Even the moon sees what's going on, but the stars remain in the dark, as does the chess player, who sits with all his pieces in position.
שחקן השחמט. הלכו, כולם הלכו להם. הלכו מאכילי היונים. הלכו הקשישים על הספסלים. הלכו הגבירות בכסיות הלבנות עם כלבי הדני הענקיים. הלכו האוהבים שחשבו לבוא. הלך האיש בחליפת שלושה חלקים. הלך האיש שהיה להקת שלושה נגנים. הלך האיש שניצב על ארגז החלב עם תנ"ך בידו. אפילו הציפורים הלכו להם. עכשיו גם העצים שוקלים ללכת. והעשב מנסה להיכנע ולהסגיר את עצמו. האוטובוסים כמובן לא עוברים עוד, וילדים לא שואלים עוד. האוויר רוצה ללכת, אבל שרוי בוויכוחים. העננים מנסים לשמור על מרחק. השמיים מגששים אחר ידיהם. אפילו הירח רואה מה קורה. אבל הכוכבים נשארים בחושך, כמו שחקן השחמט שיושב, וכל כליו עומדים במקומם. Well, before we go on to the questions, Howard, thank you so much for your wonderful poetry and for your presence here tonight and for your sincerity.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be included in the festival.
So you're all invited to write down questions in the chat box. And meanwhile, while you're thinking, I want to ask Utah and also Howard, the most difficult thing, I think in translation is to catch the magic. And there is this magic that flows from English to Hebrew, and it's a magic to do the magic. How did you do the magic? I know there is no way you can answer it, but this is maybe a Zen question. If the answer will be silence, that will be okay too. How do you do this magic?
You're talking to me?
Talking to both of you, that's the magic here. You both made the same magic.
Well,
Yeah, I think it's both of us, definitely. I mean, I had a wonderful poetry to work with to begin with. And then, as you said, there's no answer to it. You just, every translation is a miracle. And every time is like the first time you pray that the miracle will happen this time again. But I think you really have to love and appreciate what you're translating. Otherwise, the miracle won't happen.
So it's love.
So it's love, as usual, yeah, in the end.
So we'll see if there are questions. Everybody are just cheering, speechless, how wonderful it is. This is great to read it.
Well, I can certainly ask Tal more questions.
גלעד, יש שאלה בצ'אט.
Okay.
אני לא רואה אותה. Oh, okay.
Has having your poems translated into Hebrew had an impact on the poems you're writing now in any way?
I don't think so. I don't think so. No, no. But I listened to Tal read the poems in Hebrew, and I'm being honest when I say that listening to some of the poems in Hebrew, I prefer listening to them read in Hebrew than having them read in English.
Can you understand the Hebrew or some of the Hebrew
Well,
when you read translations?
Well, I can certainly understand my poems translated into Hebrew because they're my poems. So it's a lot easier for me to understand the Hebrew translation. I can read and I've read Israeli poets in Hebrew. It's a little more challenging. But knowing what I know, that I've written, that the poems are mine, I can make sense of the poems in it. So, but one of the things that Rafi touched upon in his foreword to the book, Tal, was, the Hebrew language, in a way, the first poem that was read was Passage, and you have words like wind and moon, Yareach and Ruach. So there is no commonality between wind and moon in the English language, but in the Hebrew language, ruach and yareach, and Tal, I guess you can speak to this better than I can, right? Is it not coming from the same, the shoresh is the same?
No, it's not the same shoresh, but this is what I have mentioned before, the privilege of translating into Hebrew, which can be, such a poetic and musical language in itself. You always ask yourself what's lost in translation. And I sometimes have to say that some poems gain from being translated into Hebrew, not specifically by me, of course, but by being reading again in Hebrew, and suddenly you discover more layers and more relationships, like a new relationship between the moon and the wind.
Yes.
It's a totally new relationship in Hebrew. But we have suddenly an avalanche of questions here. Avner Niv is asking, thinking of the chess places in New York City, I remember the spot on the Upper West Side near the Nature Museum. Did you think of a specific place?
No. A person playing chess in a park is an image that has always captivated me, and that image is certainly not confined to New York City. And I grew up playing chess, but there's something also, I mean, in New York City, in Washington Square Park, you'll see men waiting to play chess, but I don't think it has anything to do with the poem. The chess player, however one wants to interpret the poem, to me, ultimately, it's a poem about defiance. And that to me is at its core what the poem is about.
That's interesting, because when I translated it, I definitely had Washington Square in mind, and maybe also the players in Union Square. But Washington Square, with the old ladies and the dogs and the lovers,
yes,
very present.
Yeah, well, yes. Maybe Central Park as well. I'm not. The poem was written many years ago. Yeah. But I think it has more to do just with the chess player is a universal figure in parks around the world, and I think certainly living in the city, those images got imprinted. But in the writing of the poem, it had less to do with any particular place than it has to do with the concept of the person playing chess in a park, whether it be London, New York, Paris, wherever.
I have lots of interesting questions now. I hope we have time for most of them. Okay, Katie Hall. It seems so often in your poetry that there is a sense of something being just out of reach, that we're seeking something just beyond our kin or skin, our understanding, that we are always seeking. Do you find the spirit of searching or seeking to be a commonality of men? We miss what we miss.
I think it's a good question. I think the act of writing of a poem is, for me, most of the poems begin with a fragment of a thought that usually doesn't make sense to me or to another person, and it becomes an exploration. So I'm trying to make sense of something that doesn't make sense. And the poem is trying to make sense of my engagement with the world. So there is seeking in the writing of the poem. There is a seeking just in the act of writing of the poem to try and make sense of our surroundings, of our world, and how we engage with it. So I don't think I'm doing justice to your question, but as a first pass.
Yes, there are many questions, but it's we're coming now to the end of this session, because in half an hour we have another event, Italian event. And Tal, and Howard, last words for this event, if you want to say something, add something.
I'll leave the last word to Howard, and thank you so much for participating, and thank you for everyone who came to listen. Howard.
I echo Tal's words. Thank you, everyone. And thank you especially, Tal, for your translations, your engagement with the work. I'm touched and honored, and I enjoyed. This is really my first time listening to you read my poems in Hebrew, and it's been a great pleasure for me. So thank you.
I'll just repeat the invitation. Howard is planning to come to Israel in May, and in exactly 2 months of today, May 23rd, we'll have a reading in Sipur Pashut in Tel Aviv, and everyone is invited. So all the questions that remain unanswered are invited also to make themselves present there in Sipur Pashut in 2 months.
So thank you very much, and Tal, and all our viewers for this really wonderful reading and inspiring reading. And I invite you all to join us in about 25 minutes. It will be the Italian poetry show, Valerio Magrelli and Jonathan Fine. So see you soon, and thank you again.